Nicholas Winslow had spent his entire life building an empire, controlling every aspect of his world with precision. Power, wealth, and influence, those were the only things that mattered. But on an ordinary afternoon at an exclusive golf course, everything changed with just 4 simple words from 2 small children. "You're our dad." Standing before him were a boy and a girl, no older than 6, their identical brown eyes staring up at him with a mixture of hope and hesitation. He didn't know their names. He had never seen them before. And yet, something about them felt undeniably familiar. For the first time in his life, Nicholas, ruthless, unstoppable, always in control, felt completely unprepared. Because if what they were saying was true, then his life wasn't just his own anymore. It belonged to them, too. Nicholas Winslow had built his life on precision, control, and absolute certainty. He wasn't the kind of man who believed in surprises. His world revolved around structured meetings, multi-million-dollar deals, and an unshakable routine that kept him at the top. His name carried weight in every boardroom, his influence stretching across industries, making him one of the most powerful CEOs in the country. Golf was one of the few escapes he allowed himself. It wasn't just a hobby, it was a way to clear his mind, to step away from the never-ending demands of his empire. The private course he frequented was exclusive, surrounded by manicured greenery and the quiet hum of luxury. He had played this course dozens of times, and today was supposed to be like any other. As he lined up his next shot, he focused on the ball, blocking out everything else. His grip was firm, his stance perfect, and just as he was about to swing, a small voice cut through the quiet. "Excuse me, sir." Nicholas paused, startled by the unexpected interruption. He turned, expecting to see an employee, perhaps someone from the clubhouse. Instead, standing a few feet away, were 2 small children, a boy and a girl, both around 6 years old. They had identical deep brown eyes and chestnut-colored hair, features so eerily similar it was clear they were siblings. He frowned, confused by their presence. Children weren't usually allowed on the course unless they were guests of members, and he certainly hadn't invited any. He lowered his club and studied them, noting the nervous way they shifted on their feet. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone neutral but firm. The children exchanged a look, and after a brief hesitation, the girl stepped forward, her small hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You're our dad," she said. The words landed like a hammer against his chest, shocking him in a way he hadn't expected. For a moment, he wondered if he had misheard her, but the boy nodded in agreement, his expression just as serious. "You're our dad," he repeated. Nicholas felt the ground shift beneath him. His mind scrambled for a logical explanation. This had to be a mistake. A misunderstanding. Perhaps they had mistaken him for someone else. He had no children. He had never been married, never been in a situation where he would have unknowingly fathered a child. "You must have me confused with someone else," he said carefully, his voice even despite the confusion swirling inside him. "Where are your parents?" The girl's lips pressed together, and the boy looked down at the ground. A heaviness settled between them before the girl spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "Our mom is gone," she said. Nicholas barely registered the words before the boy pulled something from his small backpack. He stepped closer and held out a photograph with small, trembling hands. Nicholas hesitated before taking it. The moment his eyes landed on the image, his breath caught in his throat. It was a photo of him, much younger, smiling beside a woman he once knew all too well. Isabella. Memories came rushing back, hitting him like a tidal wave. He had met Isabella years ago, back when he was still building his career, still climbing his way to the top. Their relationship had been intense but fleeting, ending as quickly as it began. He had left, too focused on his ambition to consider a future with her. He had never known she was pregnant. His gaze snapped back to the children. Their eyes, the shape of their faces, it was undeniable. They were Isabella's. And if they were hers, then they were his. His voice came out rough, almost unsteady. I didn't know. The girl, Sophie, looked at him with an expression far too wise for her age. We know, she said simply. Nicholas felt his grip tighten around the photograph, his carefully constructed world cracking at the edges. He had spent his life planning every move, controlling every variable. But now, standing in the middle of a golf course with two children staring up at him, waiting for a response, he realized something terrifying. For the first time in years, he had absolutely no idea what to do. Nicholas sat in his office, staring at the photograph in his hands as if looking at it long enough would somehow change reality. The past 24 hours had been nothing short of surreal. He had walked onto that golf course expecting nothing more than a quiet afternoon, and instead, he had walked away with the knowledge that he had two 6-year-old children he had never even known existed. Sophie and Liam. Their names echoed in his mind, feeling both foreign and strangely familiar at the same time. He had barely spoken after their revelation, too stunned to formulate a proper response. He had told them to wait while he made a few phone calls, needing time to process what had just happened. But now, sitting alone in his towering office, overlooking the city he had spent years conquering, he realized something unsettling: no amount of wealth, power, or influence could prepare him for this. His assistant, Daniel Grayson, entered the office with his usual efficiency, setting a folder on the desk before taking a measured step back. Daniel had worked for Nicholas long enough to sense when something was wrong, and today, the tension in the air was undeniable. I made a few calls, sir, Daniel said, keeping his voice professional but cautious. Everything checks out. Their mother, Isabella Carter, passed away 3 months ago. Cancer. She was never married, no recorded long-term partners. And as far as I can tell, she never attempted to contact you. Nicholas exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. He had already suspected it was true, but hearing it confirmed made it feel heavier. Isabella had been sick, and he hadn't even known. Had she planned to tell him? Or had she decided he was better off never knowing? Daniel continued, his tone neutral. The children were placed in temporary care with a family friend, but there's no legal guardian assigned to them. If you wanted to contest custody, it wouldn't be difficult. Given your status and resources, you could have full custody within a matter of weeks. Nicholas looked up sharply. Custody? Daniel met his gaze without hesitation. Sir, they have no one else. The courts will look for the closest living relative, and that's you. Nicholas leaned back in his chair, gripping the arms of it as he tried to process the weight of that statement. Custody. Responsibility. Parenthood. None of these were words he had ever associated with himself. He had spent his entire life avoiding attachments, ensuring that nothing and no one could ever slow him down. Now, 2 children had walked into his life and turned that entire philosophy upside down. He wasn't a father. He wasn't built for it. And yet, when he had looked into Sophie's determined eyes and heard Liam's quiet hesitation, something in him had cracked. They had come to him because they had nowhere else to go. They had been waiting for him to reject them, to turn them away like some distant stranger with no obligation to care. Where are they now? Nicholas asked, his voice lower than before. Daniel glanced at his watch. They're still at the hotel suite you arranged for them. I made sure they had everything they needed, clothes, food, whatever they might require for the next few days. Nicholas nodded absently, his mind already elsewhere. He had been so focused on gathering information, on verifying the truth, that he hadn't stopped to consider what those kids were thinking. He had left them in a hotel room with strangers, in an unfamiliar place, after they had just lost the only parent they had ever known. And what had he done? He had gone back to his office, trying to make sense of it in a way that fit neatly into his structured world. It didn't fit. Nothing about this fit. After a long pause, he stood up, grabbing his jacket from the chair. I need to see them, he said, more to himself than to Daniel. Daniel nodded, stepping aside as Nicholas strode toward the elevator. Should I have legal start the custody paperwork? Daniel asked before Nicholas stepped inside. Nicholas hesitated for a fraction of a second, then shook his head. Not yet, he said. I need to figure out what they need from me first. As the elevator doors closed, he let out a slow breath. He didn't know how to be a father. He didn't know if he could be one. But for the first time in his life, that uncertainty didn't make him run. It made him move forward. Nicholas stepped out of the sleek black car in front of the five-star hotel, his mind still racing as he made his way through the grand lobby. He barely noticed the marble floors, the soft hum of classical music playing in the background, or the murmurs of other guests passing by. His focus was solely on one thing, the two children waiting for him upstairs. He had no idea what he was walking into. He had spent the past few hours trying to process the fact that he had children at all, but now came the real challenge. What was he supposed to say to them? How was he supposed to act? These weren't business negotiations, and they weren't employees he could instruct. They were two 6-year-olds who had just lost their mother, and now they were looking at him as their last remaining hope. As he entered the elevator and pressed the button for the top floor, he clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. He had built his entire life on confidence and control. He could handle billion-dollar deals and high-stakes boardroom battles, yet the thought of facing two children had him more unsettled than he'd ever admit. The elevator doors slid open, and Daniel was already waiting for him in the hallway. Without a word, he led Nicholas to the suite's double doors and gestured for him to go inside. They've been quiet, Daniel said. A little overwhelmed, but they've been taken care of. Nicholas nodded, hesitating for only a second before he pushed the doors open and stepped inside. The suite was spacious, elegantly furnished, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. It was the kind of place most people would be in awe of, but when Nicholas's eyes landed on the two small figures sitting side by side on the couch, he knew that luxury meant nothing to them right now. Sophie and Liam sat close together, their small bodies tense. Sophie had her arms crossed, her little legs swinging slightly as she stared at the floor. Liam clutched a stuffed bear in his hands, his grip tight as if he was holding on to the last bit of familiarity he had left. When they looked up and saw him standing there, a mix of emotions crossed their faces, uncertainty, curiosity, and something deeper. Nicholas cleared his throat, suddenly feeling unprepared. Hey. It wasn't much, but it was the best he could manage. Sophie was the first to speak. You came. There was no accusation in her tone, just a simple observation. As if she hadn't been entirely sure whether he would show up at all. Nicholas took a few steps forward, resisting the urge to shove his hands into his pockets like a nervous teenager. Of course, I did. Liam didn't say anything, but his eyes stayed locked on Nicholas, studying him in a way that made him feel like he was the one being evaluated. After a brief pause, Nicholas sighed and sat down in the armchair across from them. I know this is unexpected, he admitted. For all of us. Sophie tilted her head. You didn't know about us, did you? He could have lied. He could have said something to make himself look better, to avoid the truth. But looking at them, so small yet already carrying the weight of loss, he knew they deserved honesty. No, he said quietly. I didn't know. Liam spoke for the first time. Would you have wanted to? The question hit harder than Nicholas expected. He opened his mouth to answer, but for once in his life, words failed him. The truth was, he didn't know. Would he have stayed if Isabella had told him? Would he have been a father? Or would he have been the same man he was back then, ambitious, focused, and unwilling to slow down for anything? I don't know, he finally admitted. But I know that now, I have a choice. And I want to do this right. Sophie's eyes narrowed slightly. What does that mean? Nicholas ran a hand through his hair. It means I want to get to know you. I want to make sure you're okay. And if you'll let me, I want to figure out what happens next together. Liam looked down at his stuffed bear, tracing a finger over its worn-out fabric. We don't have anywhere else to go. Those words made something tighten in Nicholas's chest. You don't have to, he said, his voice firm. You have me now. The room fell silent, but something in the air shifted. It wasn't instant acceptance, but it wasn't rejection either. It was something in between, an unspoken agreement to see where this would lead. Sophie finally sighed, unfolding her arms. I guess we'll see if you're any good at this. Nicholas let out a small, breathless chuckle. I guess we will. For the first time since he had met them, the fear of failure wasn't the thing that terrified him the most. It was the possibility that he might actually want to be a father, and the fact that for the first time in his life, he had something to lose. Nicholas had faced countless challenges in his life, hostile business takeovers, billion-dollar negotiations, and ruthless competitors trying to bring him down. But nothing had prepared him for waking up in the morning knowing that there were now 2 6-year-olds living in his home. After their conversation in the hotel suite, he had made a decision. He wasn't going to let them stay in a hotel indefinitely, and he certainly wasn't going to let them feel like they were temporary guests. So, without hesitation, he had brought them to his penthouse, a place that, up until now, had been his sanctuary. The next morning, as he walked into the kitchen, he realized just how much his life had changed in less than 24 hours. Normally, his mornings were quiet and controlled. He'd wake up, have his coffee prepared by his housekeeper, glance at the financial reports on his tablet, and mentally prepare for the day. But today, the kitchen was anything but quiet. Sophie sat at the counter, legs swinging as she ate a piece of toast, her curly brown hair sticking up in wild directions. Liam was next to her, his eyes still heavy with sleep, but his little fingers clutched a spoon as he lazily stirred a bowl of cereal. His stuffed bear sat beside his plate, as if it needed breakfast too. Nicholas stood in the doorway, momentarily unsure of what to do. Sophie was the first to notice him. Morning, she said through a mouthful of toast. Liam didn't look up, still more focused on his cereal than on Nicholas's presence. Nicholas cleared his throat. Morning. He wasn't sure if he was supposed to sit with them. He wasn't used to this. He could close a billion-dollar deal in under an hour, but he had no idea what the protocol was for breakfast with kids. Sophie studied him with a knowing look, as if she could tell he was completely out of his element. You don't eat breakfast? She asked. Nicholas hesitated before walking to the coffee maker. I usually just have coffee. Sophie made a face. That's boring. Liam finally looked up. Coffee's gross. Nicholas smirked. It is when you're 6. Sophie set her toast down and leaned forward. So, what now? Nicholas turned to face them, gripping his coffee mug as if it could give him answers. Now, we figure things out. I've already spoken to my team about school options for you both, and we'll make sure you have everything you need. Liam frowned. We already went to school. I know, Nicholas said. But that was before. You're here now, and I want to make sure you're somewhere safe, somewhere you feel comfortable. Sophie tilted her head. Are we staying? The question hung in the air longer than it should have. Nicholas could see it in their eyes. They were waiting for reassurance, waiting to hear that they weren't just passing through his life. He knew what they needed to hear, but the weight of those words felt heavier than anything he had ever carried before. Yes, he said finally. You're staying. Sophie smiled slightly, but Liam didn't react right away. Instead, he pushed his cereal bowl aside and looked down at his bear. What if you change your mind? Liam asked quietly. Nicholas set his coffee down and walked over, crouching so he was at the boy's eye level. I won't. Liam still didn't look convinced. You didn't know about us before. What if you decide you don't want us now? Nicholas felt a sharp pang in his chest. He had spent his whole life making promises in business, and he had never once made a deal he wasn't sure he could keep. But this was different. This wasn't about contracts or negotiations. This was about trust, something that had clearly been broken before. He took a slow breath. I didn't know about you before, and I can't change that. But I know about you now. And I'm not going anywhere. Liam finally met his gaze, searching his face for any sign of dishonesty. Whatever he saw must have been enough, because after a long pause, he gave a small nod and pulled his stuffed bear closer. Nicholas stood up, feeling an unfamiliar weight in his chest. Responsibility. It wasn't something he had ever wanted before, but now it was staring him right in the face. Sophie broke the silence. So, if we're staying, does that mean we get our own rooms? Nicholas chuckled. Of course. I already have people setting them up. Sophie grinned. Cool. Can mine be purple? Nicholas raised an eyebrow. Purple. Yeah, she said as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. It's my favorite color. Nicholas smirked. Noted. Sophie picked up her toast again. And we should probably get a dog too. Nicholas choked on his coffee. Let's take this one step at a time. Sophie giggled, while Liam finally cracked a tiny smile. It wasn't much, but it was something. Nicholas exhaled, realizing that this was just the beginning. He had built his entire life on power, control, and wealth, but none of that mattered here. What mattered was sitting in front of him, two kids who were now his responsibility, whether he was ready for it or not. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about his next business move. He was thinking about what it meant to be a father. Nicholas had always prided himself on being a man who could adapt to any situation. No challenge was too great, no problem too complex. He had spent years building an empire by making quick, decisive moves, always staying one step ahead of everyone else. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for the chaos that came with having two 6-year-olds in his home. The morning after their first breakfast together, he had expected the day to go smoothly. He had arranged meetings to discuss their schooling, hired a professional to oversee their needs, and even ensured that their rooms were being designed exactly how they wanted. He had thought that covering logistics would be enough, that structure and organization would make things easier. But by the afternoon, he realized how badly he had underestimated what it truly meant to have children in his life. His penthouse, which had always been an oasis of order and precision, now felt like it belonged to someone else. Sophie had somehow managed to turn his living room into an art studio, with crayons and papers scattered across his expensive marble coffee table. Liam, on the other hand, had discovered the smart home system and was now pressing buttons on the wall panel, adjusting the lighting and temperature just to see what would happen. Every few seconds, the room shifted from warm to cold, from dim to blindingly bright. Nicholas rubbed his temples, watching as his once pristine space descended into mild chaos. Sophie, do you have to spread everything out on the table? He asked, eyeing the mess of drawings in front of her. Sophie looked up, unfazed. I'm making a picture for you. That made him pause. He hadn't expected that. For me? She nodded, holding up a sheet of paper with a drawing of 3 stick figures, one tall, 2 short. At the top, in large, uneven letters, she had written, "Our new family." Nicholas stared at the drawing, his throat tightening in a way he didn't expect. He wasn't sure what to say. Before he could respond, Liam called out from across the room. Hey, what does this button do? Nicholas turned just in time to see the living room blinds suddenly rise, then lower again, then rise once more in rapid succession. Liam, fascinated by the effect, pressed the button again. Liam, Nicholas said, keeping his voice level. Stop pressing random buttons. Liam hesitated, then looked at him with an innocent expression. Why? It's fun. Nicholas sighed, walking over to the panel and disabling the controls. Because I don't want my penthouse turning into a light show. Liam frowned slightly. It's too quiet in here. Nicholas arched a brow. I thought kids liked quiet. Not really, Sophie chimed in. Our old house was always noisy. Mom would sing while she cooked, and we had a dog that barked at everything. It was fun. Nicholas wasn't sure how to respond to that. His home had always been quiet, too quiet, maybe. It had never felt empty before, but now, standing here with them, he wondered if it always had been. After a brief silence, Sophie changed the subject. So, when do we start school? Nicholas took a seat on the couch, deciding that if he was going to get used to this, he might as well try to relax. I'm looking into a few options. It needs to be a school that fits both of you. Liam looked skeptical. Do we have to go to a fancy school? Nicholas smirked. Would that be a problem? Liam shrugged. I don't know. We've never been to a fancy school before. Nicholas leaned back, realizing that the idea of luxury, which had always been normal to him, was completely foreign to them. It doesn't have to be fancy. It just has to be good. Sophie tapped her pencil against the table. Will you take us there? On the first day? Nicholas hesitated, then nodded. Yeah. I'll take you. She seemed satisfied with that, returning to her drawing. Liam, however, still seemed hesitant. Nicholas could tell there was something on his mind. What is it? Nicholas asked. Liam fiddled with the stuffed bear in his lap before looking up. Are we staying for real? Or just for now? The question made Nicholas pause. He could tell that, despite their playful attitudes, both of them were waiting for the moment he would decide this was all too much and send them away. It made something inside him tighten. You're staying, he said firmly. For real. Liam studied him for a long moment before giving a small nod, as if testing whether he could believe him. Sophie, on the other hand, smiled. Good. Because I already started decorating my room in my head. Nicholas chuckled, shaking his head. Of course you did. As the day went on, the chaos didn't lessen, but something else settled into place, something Nicholas hadn't realized he had been missing. The laughter, the energy, the small but significant moments of connection. His world had been built around control, but these two kids had entered his life and shattered every wall he had built around himself. And instead of trying to fix it, he found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, he was okay with letting it stay that way. Nicholas had spent years believing that control was the key to success. His life had been carefully structured, every decision calculated, every move deliberate. Yet, in just a few days, two 6-year-olds had completely dismantled that control. He wasn't sure whether to be frustrated or impressed by how effortlessly Sophie and Liam had forced their way into his world, not with demands or expectations, but simply by existing in a way that made it impossible for him to ignore them. That morning, he woke up to the sound of muffled giggles coming from down the hall. At first, he thought he was imagining it, but as he sat up in bed and listened more closely, the sound became clearer. It was followed by the distinct shuffle of small feet and then, suspicious silence. Nicholas sighed, rubbing a hand over his face before getting out of bed. He hadn't needed an alarm clock since Sophie and Liam had moved in. His once quiet mornings had been replaced with a new kind of unpredictability, and as much as he wanted to pretend it irritated him, the truth was, he didn't mind as much as he thought he would. Pulling on a robe, he stepped out of his bedroom and followed the faint whispering down the hallway. The noise was coming from the kitchen. He stopped in the doorway and took in the scene in front of him. Sophie and Liam stood by the kitchen island, their backs turned to him as they huddled over something. The countertop was covered in flour, sugar, and what looked like a spilled bottle of syrup. Liam was holding a measuring cup, his small fingers gripping it tightly as he tried to pour something into a mixing bowl. Sophie was beside him, her expression focused as she cracked an egg, badly. Half of the shell fell into the bowl, and instead of removing it, she just stirred it in. Nicholas crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. Do I even want to know what's happening here? Both children jumped at the sound of his voice. Sophie whirled around first, her expression shifting between guilt and excitement. Liam turned next, his eyes wide like he had just been caught in the middle of committing a crime. We're making breakfast, Sophie announced proudly. Nicholas arched a brow. Are you? Liam looked down at the mess in front of him, then back up at Nicholas. We were trying to. Nicholas exhaled, stepping forward to inspect the damage. The pancakes, or whatever they were supposed to be, looked like a disaster, the batter a lumpy mess. The stovetop was off, which meant they hadn't attempted to actually cook anything yet, and for that, Nicholas was grateful. He rubbed his temples. Let me get this straight. Instead of just waiting for breakfast, you decided to destroy my kitchen. Sophie put her hands on her hips. It's not destroyed. We're just experimenting. Nicholas couldn't help the small smirk that tugged at his lips. He should have been annoyed. He should have been lecturing them about making a mess and not playing with things they didn't know how to use. But instead, he found himself staring at them, at their eager expressions, at the way Liam kept fidgeting with his measuring cup like he was still determined to get it right. He sighed, shaking his head. All right, move over. Sophie frowned. Why? Because if you're going to make breakfast in my kitchen, you're at least going to do it right, Nicholas said, rolling up his sleeves. Liam's eyes widened. You know how to cook. Nicholas smirked. Surprised? Sophie nodded. You don't look like someone who cooks. Nicholas let out a low chuckle. I don't do it often, but I know enough. He reached for the mixing bowl, grimacing slightly at the consistency. Okay, first of all, you don't just crack eggs and leave the shells in. Sophie shrugged. They're small. No one would notice. Nicholas gave her a pointed look before carefully fishing out the pieces of eggshell. Trust me. They would. For the next 20 minutes, he guided them through the process properly, showing them how to mix the ingredients, how to pour just the right amount of batter into the pan, and how to flip a pancake without destroying it. At first, they were skeptical, but as the pancake started to take shape, they got more excited. When Liam successfully flipped his first pancake without dropping it, he grinned up at Nicholas. I did it. Nicholas nodded approvingly. Not bad. Sophie, not wanting to be left behind, quickly flipped hers, only for it to land half off the pan. She huffed. Mine's broken. Nicholas smirked. It's still edible. Sophie frowned, then looked at the misshapen pancake. Yeah. I guess it just looks unique. Let's call it creative cooking, Nicholas said. Once the pancakes were finally done, they sat at the kitchen island together, plates stacked high with syrup-drenched food. It wasn't perfect. The pancakes were uneven, some were slightly burnt, and there was still flour dusting the countertops. But when Sophie took her first bite and smiled, and when Liam eagerly dug into his plate, Nicholas felt something he hadn't expected. This moment, this small, chaotic, completely unplanned morning, felt real. It wasn't business. It wasn't strategy. It was just them, figuring things out together. Sophie looked at him between bites. So, do we get to cook again? Nicholas raised an eyebrow. If you promise not to turn my kitchen into a disaster zone, maybe. Liam grinned. So, probably not. Nicholas sighed, shaking his head with a smirk. Yeah. Probably not. As they finished their breakfast, he realized something. He had spent years building a life that revolved around success, wealth, and discipline. But in this moment, sitting with two kids who had somehow become the most unexpected part of his world, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, this was what life was really supposed to be about. Nicholas had always believed that change was something you controlled. In business, he was the one who made the decisions, the one who dictated the terms. He strategized, planned, and ensured that every move he made was deliberate. But this wasn't something he had planned for. Sophie and Liam had entered his life like a storm, turning everything upside down, and yet, somehow, he wasn't trying to fix it. He wasn't looking for an escape. He was learning, slowly but surely, how to adjust. A week after they had moved in, Nicholas decided it was time to take them out. He wasn't entirely sure why it felt like such a big deal, but something inside him told him it was necessary. They had been cooped up in his penthouse, adjusting to a life they had never known before, and he figured they needed a break. He picked them up from their rooms that Saturday morning, finding Sophie sprawled across her bed reading a book and Liam sitting on the floor, quietly building something out of Legos. "Get dressed," Nicholas told them. "We're going out." Sophie sat up instantly, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Where?" Nicholas smirked. "You'll see." Liam looked hesitant, glancing at Sophie before standing up slowly. "Is it a fancy place?" Nicholas raised an eyebrow. "Do you want it to be?" Liam shook his head. "Not really." "Then no. Just wear whatever you're comfortable in." It was a strange thing, watching them interact with the world outside of the carefully controlled environment he had created for them. He took them to a park, a large one, filled with families, laughter, and the kind of chaotic energy that had always been foreign to him. He had never spent time in places like this before, never had a reason to, but as he watched Sophie run ahead, her excitement evident in every movement, he realized how unfamiliar this was not just for them, but for him as well. Liam was more reserved, sticking close to Nicholas's side as they walked along the winding paths. The boy was cautious, always observing, always thinking before he acted. Nicholas recognized that trait. It was something he had mastered himself over the years, the ability to analyze a situation before engaging. "You don't have to stay right next to me the whole time," Nicholas said after a few minutes. Liam shrugged. "I don't know what to do." Nicholas exhaled, realizing that for a kid who had spent his life in a much smaller, more familiar world, this kind of freedom might have felt overwhelming. "Then let's figure it out," Nicholas said, scanning the park. His eyes landed on a small stand where they were renting out kites. He smirked. "Ever flown a kite before?" Liam shook his head, watching as Nicholas walked over and handed the man a bill before receiving a bright blue kite with a long tail. He walked back to Liam, kneeling slightly as he held it out. "Want to try?" Liam hesitated before slowly taking the string. Nicholas helped him adjust his grip before gesturing to the open field. "All right. You run, and when the wind catches it, let it go." Liam frowned. "What if it doesn't work?" Nicholas smirked. "Then we try again." It took a few tries, some frustrated sighs, a few moments of doubt, but then, suddenly, the kite lifted, catching the breeze as Liam's grip tightened around the string. His eyes widened, his mouth parting slightly in awe as he watched it rise higher and higher. Nicholas stood beside him, hands in his pockets, watching the boy's face more than the kite itself. "Not bad," he said. Liam grinned, and for the first time since they had met, Nicholas saw a spark of confidence in his eyes. They spent hours at the park. Sophie found a group of kids playing tag and immediately joined in, her laughter echoing across the open space. Liam continued flying the kite, growing more comfortable with every passing minute. Nicholas stayed nearby, observing, making sure they were okay, but something unexpected settled in his chest, a sense of contentment he hadn't felt in years. When the sun started to set, they got ice cream from a small vendor near the entrance of the park. Sophie picked strawberry, Liam chose chocolate, and Nicholas, after some light-hearted pressure from Sophie, went with vanilla. They sat on a bench, the kids eating their ice cream while Nicholas simply took in the moment. Sophie looked up at him after a while, her eyes thoughtful. You don't smile a lot, do you? Nicholas raised an eyebrow. I smile. Liam shook his head. Not really. Nicholas exhaled, taking a small bite of his ice cream. I guess I just never had a reason to. Sophie tilted her head. And now? Nicholas met her gaze, then looked at Liam, who was focused on his ice cream but listening intently. Now, Nicholas said slowly, I think I might be figuring it out. Sophie grinned before finishing the last of her cone. Good. Because I think you'd look better if you smiled more. Nicholas chuckled, shaking his head. I'll keep that in mind. As they walked back to the car, Sophie skipping ahead and Liam staying close, Nicholas realized something. This was what life was supposed to feel like, not just success, not just power, but this. Moments that didn't need to be controlled, moments that simply existed, full of laughter, warmth, and the unexpected feeling of belonging. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't just building something for himself. He was building something for them, too. Nicholas had never been the type of man to reflect on the past. His entire life had been built around forward motion, always moving, always striving, always reaching for the next goal. Looking back had never served him. It was a waste of time, a distraction. But now, sitting in his home, watching Sophie and Liam argue over what movie to watch, he found himself thinking about all the moments that had led him here. It had been a month since they had come into his life. A month since he had looked into two pairs of familiar brown eyes and realized that everything he thought he knew about his world had changed. He had spent his entire life believing he didn't need anyone, that attachments only made things complicated. Yet, here he was, no longer living for himself but for two little people who had managed to unravel every part of him without even trying. Why can't we just watch both? Liam asked, exasperated as Sophie held two DVD cases in her hands, her expression stubborn. Because The Lion King is way better than Toy Story, Sophie argued, waving the case in front of Liam's face. No, it's not, Liam shot back. Woody and Buzz are awesome. Nicholas, who had been quietly observing their back and forth, finally sighed. Flip a coin. Sophie and Liam turned to him at the same time. What? Sophie asked. Nicholas pulled a coin from his pocket and held it up. Heads for The Lion King, tails for Toy Story. Sophie narrowed her eyes. And we both have to agree to go with whatever wins? Nicholas nodded. That's how decisions work. You don't always get what you want, but at least it's fair. Liam crossed his arms. Fine. Nicholas flipped the coin, catching it in his palm before turning it over on the back of his hand. Tails, he announced. Liam grinned in victory while Sophie groaned dramatically, flopping onto the couch. Ugh, fine. But I get to pick next time. Nicholas smirked. That's fair. As Liam put the movie in, Nicholas glanced at Sophie, who was still sulking. He nudged her foot with his. Hey. You okay? She huffed. Yeah. I just hate losing. Nicholas chuckled. Yeah, I can relate. Sophie peeked up at him, her lips twitching into a small smile. You lose a lot. Nicholas exhaled. Not anymore. But when I was younger, I did. I hated it, too. Sophie sat up a little. What did you lose at? Nicholas hesitated. He wasn't used to talking about his past. No one ever asked about it, and he had never volunteered the information. But as Sophie looked at him, genuinely curious, and Liam settled onto the couch nearby, waiting for the movie to start, he found himself answering. I wasn't always the best at everything, Nicholas admitted. When I was your age, I wasn't the smartest or the fastest. There were a lot of things I wasn't good at. And every time I failed, I told myself I had to work harder. That if I worked hard enough, no one would ever beat me again. Sophie tilted her head. And did it work? Nicholas smirked. Depends on how you look at it. I stopped losing, but I also stopped playing games just for fun. Winning became the only thing that mattered. Sophie considered that for a moment, then shrugged. That sounds kinda boring. Nicholas chuckled. Yeah, it was. Liam spoke up from his spot on the couch. So you don't care about winning anymore? Nicholas met his eyes. I still care. But I've learned that some things are more important. Sophie grinned. Like us? Nicholas felt something in his chest tighten. He had spent years mastering the art of keeping people at a distance, of making sure no one ever got close enough to matter. But these two had come into his life and destroyed that wall without even trying. Yeah, he said quietly. Like you. Sophie's smile widened before she turned back to the screen, satisfied. Liam didn't say anything, but he glanced at Nicholas with something that looked a lot like understanding. As the movie started, Nicholas leaned back into the couch, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known he needed. He had spent his entire life believing that his purpose was to build an empire, to be the best, to win at all costs. But now, as he sat between two kids who had somehow become his entire world, he realized that these small, everyday moments, were the ones that truly mattered. For the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing something bigger. He wasn't looking ahead to the next challenge. For the first time, he was exactly where he wanted to be. The ending of this story is powerful because it doesn't rely on grand gestures or dramatic twists, it's meaningful in its simplicity. Nicholas Winslow starts as a man who defines himself by his success, his wealth, and his ability to control everything in his life. But as the story unfolds, he's forced to confront a truth he never expected: real fulfillment doesn't come from power or financial dominance, but from the connections we build with others. What makes this transformation so compelling is that it doesn't happen overnight. Nicholas doesn't suddenly become a perfect father, and Sophie and Liam don't immediately trust him. Their relationship develops through small moments, shared breakfasts, movie nights, and learning how to exist together. These seemingly ordinary experiences are what truly change him, showing him that love, trust, and family aren't things that can be controlled or negotiated, they have to be earned. By the final chapter, Nicholas isn't just a man who has accepted his role as a father, he wants to be one. That's the biggest shift. He no longer sees Sophie and Liam as an obligation or an unexpected disruption to his well-structured life. Instead, he recognizes that they are what make his life complete. The man who once lived only for the next deal now finds meaning in moments as simple as flipping a coin for a movie or watching a child's face light up after flying a kite. This ending is satisfying because it feels real. Nicholas doesn't magically become someone else, but he grows in a way that feels genuine and earned. The story leaves us with a sense of hope, proving that change isn't about losing who you are, it's about discovering who you were always meant to be. Alexander White had spent his entire life building an empire, controlling every aspect of his world with precision. He was the kind of man who didn't believe in surprises, until the day two 10-year-old boys walked into a luxury hotel, looked him straight in the eye, and said 4 words that shattered everything he thought he knew. "You are our father." In that moment, the billionaire CEO's carefully constructed life unraveled, leaving him with a question he had never asked himself before. What if success wasn't the most important thing he had built? Alexander White was used to luxury. As the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation, he had spent years perfecting his life, ensuring that everything ran exactly as he wanted. His time was valuable, his schedule precise, and his world free from surprises. That's why, when he walked into the lobby of the prestigious Grand Meridian Hotel in New York, his mind was already occupied with the details of his upcoming business meetings, not the possibility that his entire life was about to be turned upside down. The hotel's marble floors gleamed under the chandelier lights, and the low murmur of conversations from the wealthy guests blended seamlessly with the classical music playing in the background. Alex approached the reception desk, preparing to check into his penthouse suite, when he heard a hesitant yet determined voice behind him. "Mr. White." He barely registered the voice at first, assuming it was a hotel employee, but something about its tone made him turn around. Standing a few feet away were two boys, no older than 10, identical in every way, dark brown hair, piercing blue eyes, and expressions that mixed both nervousness and determination. Their clothes were neat but clearly not expensive, and one of them clutched a worn-out backpack as if it were the most important thing he owned. Alex frowned slightly, confused by their presence. "Yes," he replied, his voice even but guarded. The boys exchanged a look, as if silently deciding which of them should speak. Finally, the one holding the backpack stepped forward. "We need to talk to you," he said, his voice steadier than Alex expected for a child his age. Alex glanced around the lobby, noticing a few curious glances from nearby guests. He had no idea who these kids were or why they were addressing him so directly, but something about their expressions unsettled him. "I'm sorry, but do I know you?" The second boy, who had been silent until now, took a deep breath and met Alex's gaze head-on. "We're your sons." For the first time in years, Alexander White was speechless. The noise of the lobby faded into the background as his brain tried to process what he had just heard. Sons? That was impossible. He had no children. He had never been married, and he had certainly never been in a situation where he would have fathered two boys without knowing about it. A moment passed, and when he didn't respond, the first boy continued. "Our mom, she passed away a few weeks ago. Before she died, she told us who you were." Alex felt an unexpected chill run through him. There was something about the way they spoke, the confidence in their words, that made it difficult to dismiss them outright. His instincts told him this wasn't a scam, and yet the logical part of his mind refused to accept the possibility. "Who was your mother?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "Lillian Brooks," the second boy answered immediately. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. He hadn't thought about Lillian in nearly a decade, but hearing it now, from these boys who claimed to be his children, sent memories flooding back. They had been together for a short time, one of those intense, fleeting relationships that burned bright and ended abruptly. She had been kind, full of life, but their worlds had been too different. She had left without a word, and he had never seen her again. The pieces started to fit together in ways he didn't like. The timeline. The boy's age. Their resemblance to him, which he could no longer ignore now that he was truly looking at them. A tightness settled in his chest. "Why didn't she tell me?" he asked, more to himself than to them. The boy with the backpack shrugged. "We don't know. But she told us you were our dad, and now she's gone. We had nowhere else to go." Alex ran a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. This was impossible, and yet, here they were, standing in front of him, forcing him to question everything he thought he knew about his past. He wasn't sure what unsettled him more, the fact that they might actually be telling the truth or the realization that if they were, he had missed 10 years of their lives without even knowing they existed. "Come with me," he finally said, his voice steady but firm. The boys exchanged another glance before nodding in unison. Alex led them toward the elevator, his mind spinning with 1,000 questions, none of which had answers yet. If they were telling the truth, if Lillian had kept this from him all these years, then his life was about to change in ways he could have never prepared for. And for the first time in his carefully controlled world, Alexander White had no idea what would happen next. The ride up to the penthouse was silent except for the occasional ding of the elevator as it passed each floor. Alex stood with his hands in his pockets, stealing glances at the boys beside him. Now that he had time to really look at them, the resemblance was undeniable. The sharp angles of their faces, the way their brows furrowed slightly when they were deep in thought, even the way they stood, straight-backed and quietly observing everything around them, reminded him of himself. It was unsettling. When the elevator doors opened, Alex led them into his penthouse, a sleek, modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. The boys hesitated at the entrance, their gazes sweeping over the pristine furniture, the perfectly arranged decor, the cold elegance of the space. It was clear that children had never lived here. There were no scattered toys, no signs of warmth or chaos, just a home built for a man who had spent years prioritizing work over everything else. "Come in," Alex said, motioning them inside. He walked toward the kitchen, grabbing a bottle of water from the fridge before turning back to face them. "You should start from the beginning. How did you find me?" The boy with the backpack, who Alex was starting to assume was the more outspoken of the two, unzipped it and pulled out a small envelope. He placed it on the counter and slid it toward Alex. "Mom left this for us." Alex hesitated before picking it up. His fingers tightened slightly around the paper as he unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was unmistakably Lillian's, neat, slightly slanted, with a certain fluidity that he had always found beautiful. Alex. If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and Jake and Oliver have come looking for you. I know you probably have a million questions, and I wish I could be the one to answer them. The truth is, I made a choice a long time ago not to tell you. You were building your future, and I didn't want to be the one to disrupt it. I convinced myself that I was doing the right thing, that the boys would be better off not knowing a father who was too busy for them. But I see now that I was wrong. They deserve to know who you are, and you deserve to know them. They're good kids, Alex. Smart, kind, stronger than they should have to be. And now, they have no one but you, I hope you do right by them. Lillian. Alex let out a slow breath, his fingers tightening around the letter before he carefully set it down. He wasn't sure what frustrated him more, the fact that Lillian had kept them from him for 10 years, or the fact that she had been right. If she had told him back then, would he have been ready? Would he have stepped up? Or would he have convinced himself that his career was more important than raising 2 children? His throat felt tight as he looked up at the boys, his sons. Jake and Oliver. The weight of it all settled heavily on his chest. You've been on your own since she passed. His voice was quieter now, less controlled than he would have liked. Oliver, the quieter one, finally spoke. We stayed with a neighbor for a while, but she couldn't keep us. Social workers were going to put us in foster care, so we ran away. His voice was steady, but there was something in his eyes, something wary, guarded. Alex ran a hand over his face. You ran away. Do you have any idea how dangerous that is? Jake lifted his chin slightly, defiant. It was better than being separated. That hit Alex harder than he expected. The idea of them being split up, tossed into a system where no one knew or cared about them, made something cold settle in his chest. He exhaled, trying to process everything. Finally, he nodded. All right. Jake frowned slightly. All right. You're staying here, Alex said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. The boys exchanged glances, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. Just like that? Oliver asked. Alex leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. Just like that. You said you had nowhere else to go. Now you do. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, Jake nodded, as if accepting that this was real. Oliver followed a second later. Alex took a deep breath. He had no idea what he was doing, no clue how to raise 2 10-year-olds, but there was one thing he was certain of, he wasn't going to let them go. Not now. Not ever. Alex had always been a man who thrived on control. He built his life around order, logic, and careful planning. But now, for the first time in years, he felt completely out of his depth. It had been less than 24 hours since Jake and Oliver had walked into his life, and already, everything felt different. The next morning, he woke up earlier than usual, not because of an alarm or a meeting, but because the quietness of the penthouse felt heavier than before. He was used to silence, he preferred it, in fact, but now that he knew two kids were sleeping down the hall, the stillness made him uneasy. He got up, pulled on a t-shirt, and stepped into the hallway, pausing outside the guest room where they had stayed the night before. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open gently and found the room mostly untouched, except for the two backpacks sitting near the bed. The bed itself was empty. His heart jumped slightly as he turned toward the living room, his mind instantly jumping to the worst-case scenario. What if they had left? What if they had decided they didn't want to stay here with a stranger who barely knew what he was doing? But as soon as he stepped into the open space of the penthouse, he spotted them. Both boys were sitting on the floor in front of the coffee table, quietly eating bowls of cereal. Jake was flipping through channels on the TV remote, while Oliver sat cross-legged, focusing intently on a book. They both turned to look at him as he walked in. "You're up early," Jake said before turning back to the TV. Alex let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "So are you." Oliver shrugged. "We're used to waking up early." Alex ran a hand over the back of his neck. He wasn't sure what the protocol was here. Was he supposed to ask if they had slept well? If they needed anything? He wasn't even sure what kids usually ate for breakfast, but from the looks of it, they had already figured it out themselves. He walked into the kitchen, glancing at the cereal box sitting on the counter. "You guys just helped yourselves." Jake looked at him with a raised eyebrow. "We didn't think you'd cook." Alex smirked slightly. "Good call." He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, watching them. It was strange, this feeling of not knowing what came next. He was used to walking into meetings with a plan, always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. But with Jake and Oliver, he was just taking it moment by moment, unsure of what the right move was. "So," he said finally, "I figured today we could go get some things for you. Clothes, school supplies, whatever else you need." Jake looked at him suspiciously. "You don't have people who do that for you?" Alex exhaled through his nose, amused. "I do. But I figured you'd want to pick your own stuff." Oliver set his book down and studied him. "Are we going to school?" Alex paused for a second. That was something he hadn't thought about yet. He knew they had probably missed a lot of school, considering everything they had been through, but the idea of enrolling them, making it official, suddenly made everything feel even more real. "Yes," he said after a moment. "But let's take it one step at a time." The boys exchanged another glance, as if silently deciding whether to argue. Finally, Jake just shrugged and went back to his cereal. Later that morning, Alex took them to a department store downtown. He wasn't used to shopping for anything other than expensive suits and watches, so walking through the aisles of kids' clothing felt like stepping into completely foreign territory. The boys, however, seemed to know exactly what they were doing. They picked out jeans, hoodies, sneakers, simple, practical things. They didn't gravitate toward anything flashy or expensive, and Alex noticed how often they checked the price tags before adding something to the cart. "You don't have to worry about the cost," he said as he watched them hesitate over a pair of sneakers. Jake glanced at him. "We're just not used to this." Alex frowned slightly. He knew they had lived modestly with their mother, but the fact that they were so cautious with money at their age made something in his chest tighten. He didn't want them to feel like they had to hold back. "You're not going to go crazy and buy 10 pairs of shoes," he said, "but you also don't have to act like I'm going to take it all away if you pick something nice." Jake hesitated, then finally nodded, grabbing the sneakers he wanted. After the shopping trip, they stopped at a small diner for lunch. The boys were quieter than before, but not in an uncomfortable way. It was as if they were still adjusting to this new reality, just as he was. As they ate, Alex found himself watching them closely, picking up on their small differences. Jake was the more outspoken one, always the first to respond, always with a sharp comment or question. Oliver was quieter, more observant, the type to think before he spoke. It was strange how quickly Alex could see pieces of himself in both of them. "You guys want to do anything else today?" he asked as he finished his coffee. Oliver looked thoughtful. "Can we go to a bookstore?" Alex blinked, surprised. "A bookstore?" Oliver nodded. "Mom used to take us all the time." Alex wasn't sure why, but that hit him in a way he didn't expect. He had spent years not knowing about their existence, and now, suddenly, there were these small details, pieces of their lives that he had never been a part of. He had missed their first words, their first steps, their birthdays. He hadn't been there when their mother read them bedtime stories, when she took them to bookstores, when she shaped them into who they were. But he was here now. And maybe that was what mattered. "Yeah," he said, nodding. "We can go to a bookstore." Jake smirked. "You don't seem like the type of guy who reads a lot." Alex chuckled. "I read. Just not for fun." Oliver smiled for the first time that day. "Maybe we'll find you something to change that." Alex wasn't sure what kind of father he was supposed to be. He didn't have the answers, didn't have a manual for how to do this right. But as he sat there with his sons, he realized he didn't need to have everything figured out right away. He just needed to show up. And for now, that was enough. Alex had always been a man of routine. Every part of his day was planned, from the moment he woke up to the second he went to sleep. His world revolved around schedules, efficiency, and control. But now, with 2 10-year-olds living under his roof, his carefully constructed life was beginning to shift in ways he never expected. The first major adjustment was the noise. His penthouse had always been silent, a place where he could think without distractions, where the only sounds were the hum of the city outside his floor-to-ceiling windows and the occasional beep of his phone. Now, there were footsteps running down the hall, the clatter of dishes as the boys made their own breakfasts, the muffled sounds of laughter and bickering as they talked in the other room. He hadn't realized just how quiet his life had been until they arrived. One morning, as he walked into the kitchen, he found Jake standing on one of the chairs, reaching for the top shelf where Alex kept the cereal. Oliver stood nearby, arms crossed, clearly unimpressed with his brother's method. "You're going to fall," Oliver said, watching him struggle. Jake ignored him, stretching further. "I've got it." Alex leaned against the counter and raised an eyebrow. "You could just ask for help." Jake turned his head sharply, startled, and nearly lost his balance. Alex grabbed his arm before he could topple over and set him back on the floor. Jake sighed, annoyed. "I had it." "Sure you did," Alex said, amused, before pulling the cereal box down and handing it to him. Oliver smirked. "Told you." As the boys ate at the counter, Alex poured himself a cup of coffee and sat across from them. He watched them closely, trying to process the fact that just a few days ago, he didn't even know they existed. Now, they were part of his daily life. They fit into his space in a way that was both foreign and strangely natural. Jake broke the silence. "So, what exactly do you do all day?" Alex raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "You're always checking your phone, looking serious. Is your job just being a businessman?" Alex smirked. "Pretty much." Oliver glanced up. "Do you like it?" The question made Alex pause. No one had ever asked him that before. His whole life, his career had been about climbing higher, making more, winning. He never stopped to think about whether he actually liked it. "I'm good at it," he finally said. Jake leaned back in his chair. "That's not the same thing." Alex studied him, slightly impressed. "No, it's not." The conversation drifted after that, but the question stayed with Alex. Did he actually enjoy the life he had built, or had he just convinced himself that success meant happiness? He pushed the thought aside. He had more immediate things to figure out, like what he was supposed to do with the boys all day. Since you're going to be staying here for a while, we need to set up some things, he said. School, activities, maybe sports. Anything you guys are interested in? Jake shrugged. I used to play baseball. Oliver nodded. I like art. Alex made a mental note. All right. We'll look into schools first, then see about sports and art classes. Jake narrowed his eyes. You really don't know how to do this, do you? Alex huffed a quiet laugh. Not even a little. Oliver tilted his head. Then why are you trying? That question hit deeper than Alex expected. He could have easily hired someone to handle all of this. Tutors, nannies, assistants, people who actually knew how to take care of kids. But he didn't want to hand them off to someone else. He had already lost 10 years with them. He wasn't about to lose any more. Because you're my sons, he said simply. The boys exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. It was clear they weren't used to hearing that. Maybe they weren't sure if they believed him yet. After breakfast, they spent the day looking at schools. Alex had always assumed picking a school was just a matter of choosing the most prestigious one, but as he watched the boys explore the campuses, he realized it wasn't that simple. They weren't impressed by massive libraries or high-tech classrooms. They cared about things he hadn't considered, whether the teachers were nice, whether there was a baseball field, whether there was an art program Oliver could actually enjoy. By the end of the day, he let them decide. They picked a school that wasn't the most expensive or prestigious, but one that felt right to them. Alex had never let someone else make a decision that affected him before, but this time, he didn't mind. That night, as the boys got ready for bed, Alex walked past their rooms and heard them talking. He didn't mean to eavesdrop, but their voices were clear through the slightly open door. Do you think he's serious? Jake asked. I don't know, Oliver admitted. But he didn't have to let us stay. There was a pause, then Jake sighed. I guess we'll see. Alex stood there for a moment before quietly walking away. He had spent his entire life proving himself in business, showing people that he was capable, reliable, powerful. But for the first time, he realized he had something else to prove. He had to prove to his sons that he wasn't going anywhere. The first few days with Jake and Oliver had been an adjustment, but Alex quickly realized that settling into this new reality would take more than just setting up their rooms and picking out a school. The boys were polite and respectful, but there was still a distance between them, an invisible wall built from years of never knowing each other. They had lived an entire life without him, and no matter how much he wanted to make things right, trust wasn't something that could be built overnight. That morning, as he walked into the kitchen, he found Oliver sitting at the counter, sketching in a notebook. His brow was furrowed in concentration, his pencil moving smoothly across the page. Jake, on the other hand, was standing in front of the open fridge, staring at its contents as if waiting for something to magically appear. You're just going to stand there all morning, or are you actually going to pick something? Alex asked, leaning against the counter with his coffee. Jake turned his head slightly. I'm thinking. Alex smirked. You think a lot for someone who eats the same thing every day. Jake rolled his eyes and grabbed a yogurt, while Oliver continued sketching, seemingly lost in his own world. Alex glanced at the paper, catching a glimpse of a detailed drawing of the city skyline. You're pretty good, Alex said, nodding toward the sketchbook. Oliver looked up, his expression unreadable, then shrugged. Mom taught me. Alex felt that familiar pang of guilt every time the boys mentioned their mother. He hated knowing how much of their life he had missed. He didn't know what Lillian had been like as a mother, but he knew she must have been good. She had raised them to be independent, smart, and far more mature than most kids their age. She must have been proud of you, Alex said. Oliver hesitated for a second, then gave a small nod. She always said I could do anything if I worked hard enough. Alex took a sip of his coffee, watching him closely. She was right. Oliver looked surprised, as if he wasn't used to hearing that from anyone but his mom. Jake, who had been quietly eating, suddenly spoke up. "What about you? What did your parents teach you?" The question caught Alex off guard. His parents weren't exactly the kind to sit him down and offer life lessons. His father had been ruthless in business and expected the same from him, while his mother had always been more concerned with social appearances than parenting. He had spent most of his life proving himself to them, making sure he never failed, because failure wasn't an option in the White family. "They taught me how to work hard," Alex said simply. Jake studied him. "That's it?" Alex set his coffee down. "That's what mattered to them." Oliver tilted his head slightly. "Is that what matters to you?" Alex wasn't sure how to answer that. For most of his life, success had been everything: building his company, growing his wealth, making sure he never showed weakness. But sitting here now, watching these two kids who were his sons but still felt like strangers, he wasn't sure if the things he once valued really meant as much as he thought. "I used to think so," he admitted. "But things change." Jake didn't push further, but the way he looked at Alex made it clear that he was still trying to figure him out. Later that afternoon, Alex decided to take them to one of the sports complexes he had a membership at. It was a high-end facility, the kind meant for professional athletes and executives who wanted exclusive access to the best equipment. He hadn't been there in months, but it was the first thing that came to mind when he thought about what to do with two energetic 10-year-olds. When they arrived, Jake's eyes lit up at the sight of the baseball field. "We can play here?" Alex nodded. "Yeah. You said you used to play, right?" Jake grinned. "Yeah, but never somewhere like this." Oliver, meanwhile, was more interested in the basketball court. He wasn't as outwardly excited as Jake, but Alex could see the curiosity in his eyes. "You guys can do whatever you want," Alex said. "Just don't break anything." Jake took off toward the batting cages while Oliver wandered toward the court, dribbling a ball experimentally. Alex sat on the bleachers, watching them, feeling strangely out of place. He was used to leading board meetings, negotiating contracts, making multi-million-dollar decisions. But sitting here, watching his kids be, well, kids, he realized how unfamiliar this world was to him. After a while, Jake jogged over, slightly out of breath. "You play?" Alex raised an eyebrow. "Baseball? Not since I was your age." Jake tossed him a glove. "Then let's see if you're any good." Alex sighed but stood up, rolling his shoulders. "All right. But if I embarrass myself, we're never speaking of this again." Jake smirked. "Deal." To his own surprise, Alex wasn't terrible. He wasn't great either, but he could still catch and throw well enough to keep up with Jake. Oliver eventually joined in, and for the first time since they had arrived, Alex saw them laughing, really laughing, not just polite smiles or small smirks. At some point, Alex caught Jake glancing at him with something that almost looked like approval. It wasn't much, but it was a start. By the time they left, the boys were exhausted but happy. As they got into the car, Jake turned to Alex. "Today wasn't bad." Alex smirked. "That's the nicest thing you've said to me so far." Jake shrugged. "You're still figuring things out. But you're trying." Oliver nodded in agreement. "Yeah. And that's more than we expected." Alex wasn't sure if that was supposed to make him feel better or worse. He knew he had a long way to go before they fully trusted him, but at least he was making progress. As they drove back to the penthouse, Alex found himself glancing at them through the rearview mirror. Maybe he wasn't the kind of father they needed yet, but for the first time in his life, he was willing to learn. The next few days were filled with small but meaningful adjustments. Alex had spent years living alone, accustomed to silence, order, and a lifestyle that revolved around work. Now, he was slowly adapting to having two 10-year-olds in his penthouse, which meant noise, unpredictability, and an ever-growing list of things he had never thought about before, like making sure there was food they actually wanted to eat, figuring out their school enrollment, and learning what it meant to be responsible for someone other than himself. One evening, after a long day at the office, he walked into the penthouse to find the boys in the living room. Oliver was sitting on the couch, sketching in his notebook as usual, while Jake was on the floor, watching a baseball game on the massive TV. There were empty snack wrappers on the coffee table, a stray sock near the couch, and a backpack half-zipped with school forms spilling out of it. It was a mess, but for some reason, Alex didn't feel the usual irritation he might have had before. Instead, he just sighed and set his briefcase down. Jake barely glanced at him. "You look tired." Alex smirked. "That obvious?" Oliver looked up from his sketchpad. "You work too much." "That's what happens when you run a company," Alex said, loosening his tie. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Ever thought about doing something else?" Alex chuckled, sinking into the armchair. "Like what?" Jake shrugged. "I don't know. Something fun." Alex tilted his head slightly. He had spent his entire adult life building his business, pushing himself harder with each passing year. Fun wasn't exactly something he had prioritized. Even when he traveled, it was for work. Even when he went to events, they were strategic networking opportunities. He hadn't done something just for the sake of enjoyment in longer than he could remember. "What do you guys consider fun?" he asked. Jake smirked. "Baseball, obviously." Oliver tapped his pencil against his sketchpad. "Reading, drawing, just having time to do stuff you actually like." Alex thought about that. His life had been built on constant movement, always thinking 10 steps ahead, never stopping long enough to enjoy the present. Maybe that was why this whole situation with the boys felt so unfamiliar. He had never really slowed down long enough to know what life outside of work was supposed to look like. A sudden thought struck him. "You two ever been to an amusement park?" Jake's eyes widened. "Like a real one? With roller coasters?" Alex nodded. Oliver shook his head. "Mom never had time to take us." Alex leaned forward. "Well, I have time now. How about we go this weekend?" Jake looked skeptical. "You? At an amusement park? Wearing what, a three-piece suit?" Alex smirked. "I do own normal clothes, you know." Oliver laughed. "I'll believe it when I see it." By the time the weekend arrived, Alex had arranged for them to visit one of the largest amusement parks just outside the city. He had expected it to be chaotic, crowded, and exhausting, which it was, but he hadn't expected to actually enjoy it. Jake ran ahead, excited about every ride, dragging Oliver along with him. They started with a roller coaster that had multiple loops, and to his own surprise, Alex found himself going along with them. The ride was fast, disorienting, and something he would have never chosen to do on his own, but when he got off and saw the way the boys were grinning at him, he realized he didn't regret it. Throughout the day, they tried different rides, played games at the carnival booths, and even stopped for lunch at one of the overpriced food stands. Jake won a stuffed bear at a basketball shooting game and immediately handed it to Oliver, who rolled his eyes but took it anyway. At one point, while they were waiting in line for another ride, Oliver looked up at Alex and said, "Mom would have liked this." Alex glanced at him. "Yeah." Oliver nodded. "She always wanted us to have fun, even when things were hard." Alex swallowed the lump in his throat. He had spent so much time thinking about what he had missed, what he hadn't been there for, but maybe what mattered more was what he was doing now. That evening, after they returned home, the boys crashed almost immediately, exhausted from the long day. Alex stood in the hallway, looking at their closed doors, realizing how different his life had become in such a short time. He had walked into that hotel weeks ago thinking he was just a businessman, someone who controlled every aspect of his life with precision. Now, he was the father of two boys who had already changed him more than he had expected. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about work. He was thinking about them. Adjusting to life with Jake and Oliver was a slow process, but every day, Alex found himself learning more about what it meant to be a father. It wasn't just about making sure they had food, clothes, or a roof over their heads. It was about the little things, the way Oliver absent-mindedly tapped his pencil against the table when he was thinking, how Jake always tested the limits of every rule just to see if Alex would actually enforce it, the way they both hesitated before asking for things as if they were still unsure if they had the right to. One evening, Alex returned home earlier than usual, something he never would have done before the boys came into his life. He walked into the penthouse to find Oliver sitting on the couch, reading a book, while Jake was lying on the floor tossing a baseball up and catching it. There was a faint smell of burnt toast lingering in the air, and when Alex glanced toward the kitchen, he saw a plate of half-eaten sandwiches on the counter. "You guys attempted to cook?" Alex asked, raising an eyebrow. Oliver didn't look up from his book. "We made grilled cheese." Jake grinned. "Mostly." Alex smirked, walking over to inspect the mess they had left behind. "I assume mostly means the first few were disasters." Jake sat up. "More like Oliver forgot you have to butter the bread first." Oliver shot him a look. "I didn't forget. I just didn't know." Alex shook his head, amused. "Remind me to show you how to use the stove properly before you burn the place down." Jake stretched his arms behind his head. "You actually cook?" Alex leaned against the counter. "I know how. I just never have the time." Oliver glanced at him. "You have time now." The words caught Alex off guard. He had spent his entire life filling every second of his schedule with work, convinced that time was his most valuable asset. But now, for the first time, he was being forced to slow down, and he wasn't sure if he hated it or if he was starting to understand why it mattered. "I guess I do," he said after a moment. "Maybe I'll teach you both something that doesn't involve burning bread." Jake smirked. "That sounds like a challenge." The next day, Alex did something he had never done before. He canceled a meeting so he could be home in time to cook dinner with the boys. He didn't tell them in advance, partly because he wasn't sure if he was actually going to follow through with it. But when he walked through the door carrying a bag of groceries instead of his usual briefcase, their surprise was clear. "You actually meant it?" Jake asked, watching as Alex set the bag on the counter. Alex rolled up his sleeves. "What, you thought I was bluffing?" Oliver stood up from the couch, looking mildly impressed. "I mean, yeah." Alex smirked. "Well, you're about to learn that I don't bluff." He wasn't an expert chef, but he knew enough to get by. He taught them how to make pasta from scratch, showing them how to knead the dough, roll it out, and cut it into strips. At first, Jake was more interested in seeing how much flour he could get on the counter, while Oliver focused intently on getting the shapes just right. Alex found himself surprisingly patient, explaining each step, answering their questions, and watching as they slowly got the hang of it. By the time they were sitting at the table eating the finished product, Jake leaned back in his chair, satisfied. "Okay, I'll admit. That was actually kind of fun." Oliver nodded. "It tastes better than the stuff from a box." Alex smirked. "Because you made it yourselves." Jake studied him for a moment, then set his fork down. "You know, you're not as bad at this as I thought you'd be." Alex raised an eyebrow. "At cooking?" Jake shrugged. "At all of it." There was something in his tone, something hesitant, like he wasn't sure he wanted to say it out loud. Alex had learned quickly that Jake was the type to test people before he trusted them. He wanted to see if Alex would stick around, if he was serious about this, or if it was just temporary. "I told you," Alex said, holding his gaze. "I'm not going anywhere." Jake didn't say anything, but after a moment, he nodded. That was enough. After dinner, Oliver stayed at the table, sketching in his notebook while Jake flipped through channels on the TV. Alex stood by the window, looking out at the city, thinking about how much had changed in such a short time. A few weeks ago, his life had been predictable, controlled. Now, it was filled with unpredictability, messiness, and moments like this, small but meaningful. He wasn't sure if he was doing everything right. He probably wasn't. But for the first time, he wasn't just thinking about himself. He was thinking about them. And that had to mean something. The following weeks passed in a way that felt both new and strangely natural. At first, Alex had expected the transition to be more difficult, that the boys would resist his presence in their lives, or that he would struggle to find common ground with them. But slowly, without him even realizing it, they had settled into a rhythm. Mornings were no longer just about rushing out the door to get to the office. Now, they included making sure Jake and Oliver had everything they needed for school, checking if Oliver had packed his sketchbook, or reminding Jake not to forget his baseball glove. Evenings weren't filled with silence and late-night work emails anymore. Now, they were spent watching movies the boys picked out, debating over which pizza toppings to order, or playing video games that Alex was admittedly terrible at but enjoyed simply because it made the boys laugh. One Saturday morning, Alex was in the kitchen making coffee when he overheard the boys talking in the living room. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but something about their conversation made him pause. "So, do you think we're staying here for good?" Jake asked, his voice quieter than usual. Oliver hesitated before answering. "I don't know. I think so. He hasn't said anything about us leaving." Jake sighed. "Yeah, but what if he changes his mind? What if he decides he doesn't want us around anymore?" Alex felt something tighten in his chest at those words. He had assumed that by now, they understood that he wasn't going anywhere, but hearing the doubt in Jake's voice made him realize that maybe they were still waiting for the moment when everything would fall apart again. They had spent their whole lives knowing what it was like to lose people, to not have stability. It made sense that they would struggle to believe that this time was different. He stepped into the living room, and both boys immediately went quiet, looking up at him like they had been caught doing something wrong. He sat down across from them, setting his coffee mug on the table, and met their eyes. "You're not going anywhere," he said firmly. Jake shifted slightly, looking down. "You say that now, but what if?" "There's no what if," Alex interrupted. "I didn't know about you before. That wasn't my choice. But now that I do, I'm not just going to pretend you don't exist. You're my sons. That doesn't change just because things aren't always easy." Oliver studied him carefully, as if trying to determine if he really meant it. "Even if we mess up sometimes?" Alex smirked. "Especially if you mess up sometimes." Jake huffed a small laugh, but there was something lighter in his expression, like maybe he was starting to believe it. That afternoon, they went to Central Park. It wasn't a big, extravagant outing, just a simple afternoon outside, but it felt like something important. Jake brought his baseball, tossing it between his hands as they walked, while Oliver had his sketchbook tucked under his arm. They wandered through the paths, stopping to watch a group of street performers for a while, then eventually found an open grassy area where Jake convinced Alex to throw the ball around with him. Oliver sat nearby, sketching, occasionally glancing up at them before going back to his drawing. After a while, Jake threw the ball back to Alex and grinned. "You're getting better." Alex caught it easily. "I was never bad." Jake smirked. "That's debatable." They played for a little while longer before Oliver finally looked up from his drawing. "I think I'm done." Jake jogged over and peered over his shoulder. "Let me see." Oliver hesitated, then turned the sketchbook around so they could both see it. It was a drawing of the three of them, Alex standing in the middle, with Jake holding a baseball glove and Oliver holding his sketchpad. The detail was impressive, but it was more than that. It was the way Oliver had captured the way they stood, the way they looked like they belonged together. Alex felt something in his chest tighten again, but this time, it wasn't guilt or regret. It was something else, something he wasn't sure he had a name for yet. "This is good," Alex said, studying the sketch. Oliver shrugged, but there was a hint of a smile on his face. "Thanks." Jake grinned. "I look cool." "You always think you look cool," Oliver muttered, rolling his eyes. They walked back toward the car as the sun started to set, the city lights beginning to flicker on in the distance. When they reached the penthouse, the boys went to their rooms, and for a moment, Alex just stood in the hallway, listening to the quiet sounds of them moving around. This place didn't feel empty anymore. It didn't feel like just a space he lived in, it felt like a home. That night, as Alex sat in his office, he glanced at his phone. His calendar was still packed, his schedule still demanding, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about work. He was thinking about what they were going to do tomorrow, what they needed for school next week, whether he should sign Jake up for a baseball league or get Oliver more art supplies. He was thinking about them. And for the first time in his life, that was what mattered most. This story is not just about unexpected fatherhood, it is about the deep transformation of a man who spent his entire life believing that success was measured only by money and power. Alexander White, accustomed to control and calculation, faced the most challenging test of all, becoming something he had never planned to be, a father. What makes this story special is not just the revelation itself but the journey the main character takes. He doesn't immediately understand that children are not just a responsibility but a true wealth that cannot be bought or planned. He has to step beyond the boundaries of his carefully structured world, learn to trust, to care, and most importantly, to put someone else before himself. The ending of this story is particularly important. It is not idealized, Alexander does not instantly become the perfect father, but he does the most important thing, he chooses to stay, he chooses not to run from this new reality but to accept it, to learn, and to change. And that is the key message, family is not something that comes ready-made, but something that is built step by step through mistakes, patience, and the willingness to be better. This story shows that true wealth is not found in money but in the people who are waiting for you to be there. And when Alexander finally realizes that his life has changed forever, he understands that he has made the most important investment of all, in family.